students 60 years ago, on 7th December 1965, on the eve of the closing of the Second Vatican Council, an event took place which is considered one of the most important ecumenical acts of the 20th century. The paradox of this act is that we don't know how to name it. The lifting of anathemas of 1054, as we know, in reality, there was neither lifting nor anathemas. As we will hear tonight, in 1054, there was no anathemas because between the churches of Rome and the Church of Constantinople, but rather excommunications between two individuals, which were, by the way, invalid. And therefore, no lifting of these anathemas was possible. However, 1054 remains the symbolic date of the so-called schism between East and West. Since 1054 is a symbol, another symbolic act was needed to heal it. To speak about this symbolic act, we have tonight the two most qualified speakers, the two co-chairs of the international theological dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, namely His Eminence Cardinal Koch, Prefect of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity, and His Eminence Metropolitan Job of Pisidia of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. I wish to express our deep gratitude to both of them for accepting the invitation of the Œcumenicum, the Institute for Ecumenical Studies of the Angelicum, which is organizing this ecumenical event as part of his TR chair, inaugurated here in 2003 by Cardinal Walter Kasper. I would like also to welcome the students of the Ecumenical Institute of Bosse on their annual study visit to Rome during the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, and also their professors and dean. I welcome the professors and students from other pontifical universities, especially from the Gregorian University and the Oriental Institute. I thank you all for coming this evening for this public lecture of the Œcumenicum. After the two presentations, we will have some time for questions and answers. May the Holy Spirit inspire us tonight, inspire our discussions, and continue to inspire our churches to undertake prophetic gestures on the path to unity. Thank you.
Eminence, Excellencies, dear professors and students, dear brothers and sisters in Christ. Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal for the prize of the heavenly calling of God in Jesus Christ. With this confession, the Apostle Paul expresses his deep longing for full communion with Jesus Christ. This confession can also serve as a guiding principle on the long path of reconciliation and the search for the restoration of communion between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches. On this long journey, too, the first step is to forget what lies behind us, namely the increasing alienation between Rome and Constantinople, which ultimately led to the separation in the Church between East and West, and was followed by centuries of misunderstandings and polemics. Such forgetting, whose deepest meaning must be forgiveness, is the prerequisite for reaching out to what lies ahead, namely that the churches of Rome and Constantinople encounter each other in faith and that ecclesial communion is restored. This long journey of reconciliation began with the historic meeting between Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, Pope Paul VI, on 5 and 6 January 1964 in Jerusalem. The mutual desire expressed at that time to restore love between the two churches, sealed with a brotherly kiss, remains before our eyes as a lasting icon of the willingness to reconcile. The memorable meeting in Jerusalem paved the way for another historic event on 7 December 1965, the day before the closing session of the Second Vatican Council, when the highest representatives of the two churches in the Patriarchal Church of St. George in Phanar, in Constantinople, and in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, removed the mutual anathemas of 1054, as stated in the joint declaration, from the memory and the midst of the Church, so that they could not longer be an obstacle to reconciliation in love. By consigning the tragic events of 1054 to forgetfulness in this way, it was also declared that they no longer belong to the official record of the churches. With this middle act, the historical poison of excommunication was removed from the organism of the Church, and the symbol of division was replaced by the symbol of love, as then the theologian Joseph Ratzinger interpreted this event theologically. I quote, "The relationship of cold love, of contradictions, mistrust, and antagonism has been replaced by a relationship of love and brotherhood, symbolized by the kiss of brotherhood. This expresses the fact that the act of 7 December 1965 was an event with ecclesiastical binding force. In this respect, it differs fundamentally from the event in 1054, when Cardinal Humbert de Silva Candida and his companions placed the bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia against, as the text states, Pseudo-Patriarch Michael and Archbishop Leon of Ochrid and their auxiliaries, and when only a few days later Patriarch Michael Carularius pronounced the counter-excommunication against the author of the bull of excommunication. This makes it clear that the bulls of excommunication were directed solely against individual personalities and not against churches. Cardinal Humbert did not pronounce a formally valid excommunication of the Byzantine Church, especially since his sentence of excommunication could not have had any canonical validity anyway, as Pope Leo IX had died 3 months earlier. The fact that the ban was not aimed at the Church can also be seen from the fact that in the same bull the Cardinal praised the Emperor and citizens of Constantinople as very Christian and Orthodox. In the eyes of Patriarch Michael II, the scandal of 1054 did not constitute a schism. Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras also recalled this important fact in their joint declaration of 7 December 1965, in which they specifically named the persons affected by the excommunications and added that the censures were directed against person and not against the churches, and they had not intended to break the ecclesial communion between the sees of Rome and of Constantinople. Monsieur Saint Destivelle, the fundamental difference between the tragic events of 1054 and the joyful events of 1965 can be summed up as follows. I quote, "While the events of 1054 affected two individuals, those of 1965 affected two churches. This naturally raises the question of the ecclesiological significance of removing the excommunications of 1054 from the memory and the midst of the church. If we take the difference between the events of 1054 and 1965 seriously, we must first note that there was no schism in 1054. Certainly, the scandal of 1054 placed a painful strain on ecclesiastical relations between Rome and Constantinople at that time. However, it was not considered at that time to be a cause of the later separation. This only happened later, when the events of 1054 were set as the date of the beginning of the schism between Latins and Greeks. It seems that people were no longer aware that there had been no definitive mutual formal condemnation in the Church between East and West, either in 1054 or at any later date. The Orthodox theologian Gregorios Larenzakis from Graz summed up this significant fact with the phrase, "No schism yet separated." Since no schism took place in 1054, the act of removing the excommunications from the midst of the Church in 1965 cannot yet signify the end of the separation in the Church between East and West and the restoration of ecclesial communion, which will find its goal in the resumption of Eucharistic communion. However, this goal is hoped for the Pope Paul VI and Patriarchate Anagoras, as they express in the joint declaration that the mutual will for reconciliation and dialogue will lead the Catholic and Orthodox churches for the greatest good of souls and the coming of the kingdom of God, to restore full communion of faith, fraternal harmony, and sacramental life as existed between them during the first millennium of the Church life. In order to achieve this ambitious goal, further steps must be taken. This therefore raises all the more the question of the ecclesiological and ecclesiopractical implications and consequences of removing the excommunication of 1054 from the memory and midst of the Church. I will mention three issues. First, dialogue of love and dialogue of truth. While the acts of excommunication in 1054 led to further alienation in the Church between East and West, and ultimately to a widespread breakdown in the relations, the joint act of lifting the excommunications in 1965 became the starting point for the restoration of dialogue of love and dialogue of truth. The dialogue of love refers to the cultivation of friendly relations between representatives of the various ecclesial communities, which are subject to an important principle of learning psychology, according to which negative emotions from the past cannot be overcome simply by information, however good they may be, but only by positive counter-emotions. direct encounters and middle acquaintance therefore have a fundamental theological significance for the restoration of unity. This soon became effective after the promising act in 1965 in the friendly relations between the Catholic Church of Rome and the Orthodox Church of Constantinople, especially with the beautiful tradition of mutual visits by representatives of the two churches on their respective patron, saints' days, or on other important occasions. It has become a remarkable custom for the respective pope to travel to the Phanar in Constantinople shortly after the beginning of his pontificate to visit the Ecumenical Patriarch. By contrast, it was a telling sign of major ecumenical friendship when Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I came to Rome for the inauguration ceremony of Pope Francis, which can be held as the first in ecumenical relations. Dialogue of love has led Christians and Christian communities in East and West to rediscover the fraternity that Pope John Paul II counted among the most important fruits of ecumenical relations. The numerous encounters and mutual visits between the churches have created a network of friendly relations that provides a solid foundation for further ecumenical relations. The decisive fruit of this practice is evident above all in the fact that Christians belonging to different church communities no longer regard each other as strangers or even adversaries, but perceive each other as brothers and sisters in faith on the basis of their common baptism. Joseph Ratzinger rightly pointed out that such a dialogue of love is not simply a private matter, but that the restoration of love is an ecclesial act. For it is not merely a humanitarian love, but a theological love, more precisely the community of love from church to church. Even if such ecclesial agape cannot yet be regarded as Eucharistic communion, it can already be appreciated as an ecclesial connection that connects churches as churches. Such a dialogue of truth, understood as a serious theological examination of the factors that have caused the separation in the Church, is necessary in order to come closer to the ecumenical goal of unity in faith, as Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew emphasized in their joint declaration in Jerusalem in 2014, stating that this dialogue is about deepening one's grasp of the whole truth that Christ has given to his church, a truth that we never cease to understand better as we follow the promptings of the Holy Spirit. A second point, cleansing of memory. An important step in initiating and implementing these two forms of dialogue is to come to terms with the history of many events and statements that have severely strained relation between Constantinople and Rome in the past and continue to have an impact in the present. But how is it possible to come to terms with the past, given the past is and remains the past, and we cannot change in the present? Or can we? In this regard, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras were guided by the insight that the past can only be brought into the present through memory. For the past is present through memory. The past can therefore only be changed if memory is changed. This makes clear the actual meaning of the joint declaration of the Pope and the Patriarch, namely that the excommunication sentences of 1054, by virtue of being removed from memory and from the heart of the Church, no longer belong to the official teachings of the churches. And by regretting the hurtful words, unfounded accusations, and condemnatory gestures, the representatives of the two churches express that the deepest content of the changed memory is forgiveness. Since the old memory of the past, which was a memory of mistrust and accusations, has been replaced by a new memory, namely the memory of love, it becomes apparent that the mutual excommunications of 1054 were, as it were, destroyed in the act of forgiveness in 1965. What happened in concrete terms was expressed by Pope Paul VI in his letter to Patriarch Athenagoras shortly after the act of removing the excommunications from the memory of the Church, saying that it was his wish, I quote, to leave the past in God's hands so that we may be completely free to prepare for a better future. The Pope was guided by the profound truths of the confession of the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Philippians, quoted at the beginning of the lecture, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. This refers to the forgetting that is described in the ecumenical movement as purification of memory, which is aimed at healing. Such purification of memory proves to be the negative prerequisite for the positive event of restoration of love. A third point, ecclesial exchange of gifts. Culturally determined differences in spirituality played a significant role in the processes of mutual alienation in the Church between East and West. These included different theological approaches too, which originally did not represent significant conflicts, but which later led to the great controversy over the so-called Filioque, which has increasingly been seen as the actual reason for the later schism in the Church. However, the growing lack of understanding and mistrust has also been linked in part to issues which we today regard either as superficialities, such as the wearing of beards by clergy, or other differences in disciplinary instructions, or which we understand as expressions of legitimate diversity within a given unity, such as differences in rites or the use of leavened or unleavened bread in the celebration of the Eucharist. Particularly with regard to the dispute over unleavened bread, which had already flared up in the run-up to the scandal of 1054, the Catholic Eastern Church historian Hans-Joachim Schulz rightly spoke of a grotesque disproportion between doctrinal relevance and ecclesial consequences. While such differences were once regarded as contradictions and even as divisive for the Church, ecumenical dialogue has made it clear that these are largely differences that can be perceived not only as legitimate, but also as enriching within the framework of a rediscovered unity. The protagonists of the Ecclesiastical Act in 1965 had already thought along these lines. In a speech during Cardinal Augustin Bea's visit to Constantinople, Patriarch Athenagoras emphasized that we certainly do not underestimate the multiplicity of the gravity of the problems we face, but that the restoration of love allows us to see the differences in a whole new light. Pope Paul VI expressed a similar sentiment in the Cathedral of Phanar. I quote, In the light of our love for Christ and our brotherly love, we discover even more the profound identity of our faith, and those points on which we still have differences must not prevent us from perceiving this profound unity. Patriarch Athenagoras and Pope Paul VI have already accomplished what is referred to in the process of ecumenical understanding as an exchange of gifts. Behind this lies the conviction that no church is so rich that it does not need to be enriched by gifts from other churches, but also that no church is so poor that it cannot make its own contribution to the ecumenical community. This middle enrichment cannot, of course, be about finding a compromise on the lowest common denominator. Rather, it is about bringing the strengths of one side into dialogue with the strength of the other in order to learn from each other, as expressed, for example, by the Orthodox Catholic Working Group of St. Irenaeus with regard to the relationship between synodality and primacy. I quote, "Above all, the churches must strive to achieve a better balance between synodality and primacy at all levels of church life, namely by strengthening synodal structures in the Catholic Church and by accepting a certain primacy within the worldwide community of churches in the Orthodox Church. In this way, unity in faith can be regained despite all the legitimate and enriching diversity of theological thinking and pastoral practice." Let us return from considering the ecclesiological and ecclesial implications of the 1965 Act to its actual purpose. By consigning the tragic events of 1054 to historical oblivion in the legally binding manner, Patriarch Athenagoras and Pope Paul VI also declared that the bulls of the excommunication should no longer have the weight they had exerted for a long throughout history, poisoning the relation between Latins and Greeks. This declaration certainly does not yet mean that church communion has been achieved, but it does represent what Hyacinthe Destivelle describes as the beginning of an ecclesiology of sister churches. This ecclesiology implies that as a first step towards the future restoration of church communion, the Church of Constantinople and the Church of Rome should mutually recognize each other as church. Where do we stand today in this regard? Of course, it is not enough for the Orthodox and Catholic churches to simply recognize each other as two different churches, as it's still commonly expressed in the phrase, "our two churches," in the sense that both churches are referred to as two different church communities. This, however, asserts a plurality of churches, above which the singular church can no longer appear, and thus the dualism remains at the ultimate level of the concept of the church, and the one church become an utopia or even a phantom, even though its very essence is that is to be a body. Mutual recognition as church is the first step towards resuming church communion. This must be followed by a second step, namely the resumption of Eucharistic communion. For where fraternal love, agape, exists in a serious sense as an ecclesial reality, it must also become Eucharistic agape in order to be credible, insofar as being a body of the Church urge itself to become a binding community in the Eucharistic body of the Lord. The Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras already expressed this meaning in 1968 in a telegram to Pope Paul VI with these urgent words, I quote, "The hour of Christian courage has come. We love one another, we profess the same common faith. Let us set out together on the path before the glory of the common holy altar to fulfill the will of the Lord, so that the Church may shine, so that the world may believe, and the peace of God may come upon all." In the same way, Pope Paul VI too had already expressed his Pope in his telegram of 9 December 1967 to Patriarch Athenagoras, that together we may be able to communicate the precious blood of the Saviour. Only with the resumption of Eucharistic communion will the ecclesiological implications and ecclesial practical consequences be fulfilled, and thus the goal of all ecumenical efforts, which were promisingly initiated with the ecclesiological important act on 7 December 1965, be achieved. And only with the resumption of Eucharistic communion will the undivided Church in East and West be restored. Thank you for your attention.
Your Eminence, Your Excellencies, first of all, I would like to extend my warm thanks to the Tillard Chair, to the Angelicum, especially to Brother Hyacinthe Destivelle for the very kind invitation and the beautiful initiative of having this evening's conference on the very important theme of the uplifting of the Anathemas. It's a great joy to be with you. The year 1054 remains a tragic year in the Christian imaginary. For many, it represents the dramatic moment of the division between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, often identified as the Great Schism of 1054. This is what, unfortunately, we can read in most encyclopedias and dictionaries, as well as in the catechisms of our churches until today. For centuries, unfortunately, we have long sought to nourish this imaginary and to search to blame the culprit. In the 19th century, Father Vladimir, born René François Guettet, a French Catholic priest converted to Orthodoxy, in one of his numerous works of religious history on the evocative title, The Schismatic Papacy, published in 1863, soon after his conversion, describes the tragic events of 1054 as follows. I quote, "Patriarch Michael refused to communicate with the legates. He undoubtedly knew that the emperor wanted, out of bias, to sacrifice the Greek Church to the papacy, to obtain some help for his throne. The letter he had received from the Pope informed him sufficiently of what was meant in Rome by the word union. The legates went to Hagia Sophia at the time when the clergy was preparing for the Mass. They complained aloud about the obstinacy of the Patriarch and placed on the altar a sentence of excommunication launched against him. They left the church shaking the dust from their feet and pronouncing anathema against those who would not communicate with the Latins. All this was done with the consent of the emperor, which explains why the Patriarch did not want to have any relationship with the legates. The people, convinced of the emperor's connivance with these envoys, had rioted. At the moment of danger, Constantine made some concessions. The legates protested that their sentence of excommunication had not been read as it stood, that the Patriarch had the most cruel and perfidious designs towards them. Whatever the case, and even if Michael had been guilty of these evil designs, their way of acting would have been neither more worthy nor more canonical. Another reproach was made against Patriarch Michael, that of having made unfounded accusations against the Latin Church. Many, in fact, were exaggerated, but we did not want to notice that. In his letter, the Patriarch was only the echo of the churches of the East. Since the papacy wanted to impose its autocracy, a strong reaction had taken place in all these churches. Under the impulse of this feeling, one sought everything that could be blamed on this Roman Church, which, in the person of its bishops, presented itself as the infallible guardian of sound doctrine. Marco Cerularius was only the interpreter of these reproaches. He would never have had enough influence to impose his true or alleged grievances on the Christian East, and those who wanted to portray him as the consummate of the schism begun under Photius only appreciated the facts in a superficial way. End of the quote. Despite the polemical tone of this work, it is remarkable that Goethe recognizes in this passage that on the one hand, many accusations made against the Latin Church by Patriarch Michael Cerularius in fact were exaggerated, and on the other hand, that those who wanted to portray him as the consummate of the schism begun under Photius only appreciated the facts in a superficial way. A century later, we have yet another reading of the facts by the illustrious French Catholic Assumptionist and Byzantinist Martin Jugy. In his no less polemical work, published in Paris in 1941 and entitled The Byzantine Schism, which he judges to be the Cerularius' schism, and of which he attempts to trace distant causes, among which he mentions the so-called ambition of the Patriarchs of Constantinople, which pushed them to want to equal themselves at all costs with the bishops of Rome. The author finally lists among the direct causes of the so-called schism the antipathies of race, national pride, and political rivalries between Greeks and Latins, and recognizes as indirect causes of this so-called schism the diversity and mutual ignorance of the Greek and Latin languages, as well as the autonomous evolution of the two churches in the theological, canonical, and liturgical domain, where the most important point, according to him, was the addition of the Filioque to the Nicene Creed, introduced in Rome at the beginning of the 11th century, and never recognized by the East. Beyond the polemical tone of the time, Jugy's merit is to have called into question the inaccuracy, the point of view perpetuated over the centuries, according to which the schism of Michael Cerularius of 1054 would have been the definite schism between the East and the West. Jugy writes, and I quote, "In the hindsight of history, the mutual excommunications of July 1054 have been considered as the fatal end of the schisms, which for many centuries periodically separated the Byzantine Church from the Western Church, where one saw in Michael Cerularius the author of the definitive schism." In fact, when we examine the documents closely, we realize that these anathemas did not have the general scope that one wanted to attribute to them. The Roman legates did not launch theirs against the Byzantine Church, but against one of its patriarchs and some of its clerics. Their sentence itself appears from a canonical point of view devoid of any value and has never been approved by the Holy See. As far for the excommunication of the legates by Michael Cerularius and his permanent synod, it affects neither the Pope nor the entire Western Church. It is a simple measure of reprisal against insolent foreigners who dare to raise the most fanciful accusations against Cerularius and his clergy, and in whom one only wanted to see emissaries of the Duke of Italy, Argyros. Instead of speaking of a definite schism, it would undoubtedly be more accurate to say that we are in the presence of the first aborted attempt of reunion. End of the quote. Regardless of his bias, the merit of Jugy's study is to have underlined that the anathemas of 1054 did not target local churches, but concrete persons. That the bull of excommunication placed on the altar of Hagia Sophia by the French Benedictine Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida had no canonical validity, since Pope Leo IX had died 3 months earlier. And above all, that the events of 1054 should be considered not as the accomplishment of a schism, but rather as an unsuccessful attempt to restore communion between the churches. These judicious remarks made it possible in the years that followed in the 20th century to demythologize the so-called schism of 1054. This is what the French Dominican Yves Congar did in his work entitled 900 Years After, Notes on the so-called Oriental Schism, where he considers the excommunication put on the altar of Hagia Sophia on 16th of July 1054 as a monument of an unimaginable incomprehension and a gesture tainted with invalidity, underlining that it was only an episode of secondary importance in a long evolution begun well before and continuing well after, which we qualified of progressive estrangement. Thus, he writes, the great schisms of 1054 resembles more of a crude construction of historiographers and polemicists in the Christian imaginary than of a historical fact. The sequel of the work of theologians not only contributed to demythologizing the schism of 1054, but went even further to erase these anathemas from the memory of the Church. Just as the cause of this excommunication had been the incomprehension of concrete persons, the lifting of these anathemas was made possible by the meeting, the sincerity, and the commitment of 2 people who believed deeply in the unity of the Church, Pope Paul VI and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras. On the one hand, this was made possible thanks to the opening of the Roman Catholic Church towards other churches, and particularly to the Christian East, during the Second Vatican Council, which declared in its decree on ecumenism Unitatis Redintegratio, promulgated in November 1964, I quote, "For this reason the Holy Council urges all, but especially those who intend to devote themselves to the restoration of full communion held between the churches of the East and the Catholic Church, to give due consideration to this special feature of the origin and growth of the Eastern churches, recalling that from the beginning the churches of the East have had a treasury from which the Western Church has drawn extensively in liturgical practice, spiritual tradition, and law. Before concluding, the very rich liturgical and spiritual heritage of the Eastern churches should be known, venerated, preserved, and cherished by all. They must recognize that this is of supreme importance for the faithful preservation of the fullness of Christian tradition and for bringing about reconciliation between Eastern and Western Christians. End of the quote. On the other hand, this was also made possible by the interest of the Orthodox Church in the Christian churches of the West during the Pan-Orthodox conferences convened in Rhodes by the Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras in the 1960s, which gave the green light to the establishment of dialogues with these churches and to the sending of Orthodox observers to the Second Vatican Council. A significant historical event took place 60 years ago, precisely at the end of the Second Vatican Council, the lifting of the regrettable anathemas of the year 1054. During a ceremony simultaneously celebrated in Rome at St. Peter's Basilica, we have seen a few, short video of that ceremony, and simultaneously also in the Patriarchal Church of St. George at the Fanar in Constantinople on 7 December 1965. In their joint declaration, Pope Paul VI and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras observed that, I quote, "Among the obstacles along the road of the development of these fraternal relations of confidence and esteem, there is the memory of the decisions, actions, and painful incidents which in 1054 resulted in the sentence of excommunication leveled against the Patriarch Michael Cerularius and two other persons by the legate of the Roman See under the leadership of Cardinal Umbertus, legates who then became the object of a similar sentence pronounced by the Patriarch and the Synod of Constantinople. Furthermore, the two primates rightly recognize the personal and exaggerated character of these anathemas, which over the centuries resulted in the estrangement of the churches. Today, they say, I quote, however, they have been judged more fairly and serenely. Thus it is important to recognize the excesses which accompanied them and later led to consequences which, insofar as we can judge, went much further than their authors had intended and foreseen. They had directed their censures against the persons concerned and not the churches. These censures were not intended to break ecclesiastical communion between the sees of Rome and Constantinople. Therefore, the two primates not only affirm to regret the offensive words, the reproaches without foundation, and the reprehensible gestures which on both sides have marked or accompanied the sad events of this period, but even decided prophetically to remove both from memory and from the midst of the Church the sentences of excommunication which follow these events, the memory of which has influenced actions up to our day and has hindered closer relations in charity, and even commit these excommunication to oblivion. These constitute a strong and courageous statement. But what does this mean concretely in practical terms? It means that there is no consummated schism between the two churches, as is still unfortunately widely believed by the Christian imaginary. It means that the regrettable events of 1054 are forgotten and erased from the memory of the two sister churches. After the lifting of the mutual anathemas of 1054, the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church find themselves in the similar state of the broken communion that the churches of Rome and Constantinople experienced at the beginning of the 11th century. To correct this problem, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras had previously initiated during their historic and prophetic meeting in Jerusalem in January 1964 a dialogue of love. This dialogue of love was intended to lead to a dialogue of truth through the creation in 1979 of the Joint International Commission for the Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church on equal grounds by mutual agreement between Pope John Paul II and Ecumenical Patriarch Dimitrios. The purpose of this commission from the beginning was very clear: the restoration of full communion between the two churches, based on the unity of faith according to the common experience and tradition of the early church, the common tradition of the first millennium, as one can read in the plan of the Commission drawn up in Rhodes in 1980. For over 45 years, the Joint International Commission has worked tirelessly and undisturbed nor distracted by ignorant, obscurantist and fundamentalist people. And today we are able to reap some fruits from that work. Having begun by considering what the two churches have in common, that is to say, a common understanding of the sacraments of the Church and a common understanding of the sacramental nature of the Church, the Commission was then able to consider the issue of synodality and primacy. The genius of the Ravenna document of 2007 lies precisely in its emphasis that the thorny issue of Roman primacy could not be separated from the question of synodality, because primacy and synodality are interdependent. Indeed, on the one hand, no one can be the first one alone without others. On the other hand, there cannot be an assembly, a synod, without a presidency. And the document of Ravenna clarified that this is true at three levels of the ecclesial experience: at the level of the local level of the eparchy, at the regional level of the episcopal synod, and also at the universal level in the communion of the patriarchal and autocephalous churches. The document of Chieti of 2016 then delved into the issue by looking more closely at the shared tradition of the first millennium, which is considered normative for both churches. And more recently, the document of Alexandria of 2023 studied the developments of ecclesial administration both in East and West during the second millennium and concluded that, I quote, "The Church is not properly understood as a pyramid with a primate governing from the top, but neither it is properly understood as a federation of self-sufficient churches." End of the quote. Personally, I am convinced that the work of the Joint International Commission has inspired the renewal of synodality within the Roman Catholic Church in recent years, during the tenure of Pope Francis. A renewal that inspires a certain, let's say, decentralization of the Roman Catholic Church, thus challenging the so-called universal jurisdiction of the Roman Pontiff, in which in this sense looks promising to careful Orthodox Christians. At this point, Pope Leo XIV seems to wish to continue this approach of his predecessor. Having made progress in the dialogue about truth, the Commission seems ready at this point in history to confront and discuss in a climate of scientific objectivity, mutual and fraternal trust, the issues that have long divided the churches. The issues such as infallibility and especially of the filioque, often considered as the major cause of the rupture of communion between Rome and Constantinople at the beginning of the 11th century, are now being studied by the Commission. Regarding this second issue, it is worth recalling that the 2003 document of the North American Catholic Orthodox Theological Consultation entitled "The Filioque, a Church Dividing Issue, an Agreed Statement," which recommended that the Catholic Church, as a consequence of the normative and irrevocable dogmatic value of the Creed of 381, use the original Greek text alone in making translations of that creed for catechetical and liturgical use, that is, without the filioque. The same recommendation was repeated, as a matter of fact, recently in 2024 in a common statement of the Joint International Commission on Theological Dialogue between the Lutheran World Federation and the Orthodox Church on the addition of the filioque clause to the Nicene Constantinopolitan symbol of faith, which suggested, I quote, that the translation of the Greek original without the filioque be used in the hope that this will contribute to the healing of age-old divisions between our communities and enable us to confess together the faith of the Ecumenical Councils of Nicaea 325 and Constantinople 381, end of the quote. In this regard, a recent event gives us particular joy. During the ecumenical commemoration of the martyrs of the faith of the 21st century, presided over by His Holiness Pope Leo XIV in the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome on 14 September 2025, last fall, the Creed of Nicaea-Constantinople was recited in Latin without the filioque. An important detail that demonstrates that things are moving forward and that the theological dialogue is bearing fruit, and this gives us great hope for the future restoration of Christian unity on the basis of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, which was considered by the Church, at least since the 5th century, as a universal symbol of faith. In the same spirit, even more recently, on the eve of his visit to the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the celebration of the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, Pope Leo XIV quotes the phrase from the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed without the filioque in his apostolic letter Unitate Fidei, promulgated on 23rd of November 2025, noting in footnote 10 that, I quote, the statement, and proceeds from the Father and the Son, filioque, is not found in the text of Constantinople. It was inserted into the Latin Creed by Pope Benedict VIII in 1014 and is a subject of Orthodox Catholic dialogue. End of the quote. This remark in a papal encyclical is of paramount importance because the official recognition of this addition by the Pope himself puts an end to a millennium of controversy that has contributed to deepening the abyss of division between the two churches. At the Common Prayer of 28th of November 2025, celebrating the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, at the very site where it took place, presided by Pope Leo and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, in the presence of the Patriarch of Alexandria, official delegates of the ancient Patriarchates of Antioch and Jerusalem, representatives of all the Oriental Orthodox churches and the Protestant World Communion, Christian communions, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed was recited together without the addition of the filioque. Of course, this also did not happen for the first time. Already in 1987, during the official visit of Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrius to Rome, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed was recited in the original Greek without the filioque by both Pope Jean Paul II and the Ecumenical Patriarch. And the same happened with Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis at several similar official liturgical occasions. This proves that the filioque is not a dogma of the Roman Catholic Church. Otherwise, these three last popes ought to be considered as heretics by their own church. And this, thank God, is not the case. As indicated on various occasions by Pope Leo XIV and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church has the official mandate from both churches to work for the restoration of full ecclesial communion between the two churches. In affirming in his address to Pope Leo XIV on 30th of November last year that, I quote, "we can only pray that issues such as the filioque and infallibility will be resolved such that their understanding no longer serve as stumbling blocks to the communion of our churches, end of the quote, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew did not ask from the Pope more than he could give, but gave hope, rather, that the restoration of communion between the two churches, interrupted a millennium ago, could soon be re-established, provided that the divided Christians grant their goodwill to this end. Will we see the restoration of full communion between our two churches before 2054? The theological dialogue undertaken between the two sister churches has this as his concrete goal. Not by seeking to reach a compromise or to betray the orthodoxy of faith, but on the contrary, to restore the communion on the ground of the common tradition of the first millennium. Already several important theological agreements have been made in these recent decades, leading the two churches on the way to the restoration of full communion. To this end, theologians work hard with all scientific objectivity and truth. But it is still necessary that the fruits of their work be received not only by the episcopate and the clergy, but also by the entire pleroma of the Church, in order to purify the Christian imaginary. Hence, the importance of making these declarations and documents better known. It is compulsory to work on the reception of these agreements. This is the only way for the desire of Christian unity to become a reality in the near future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Eminences, for these two complementary approaches and presentations, illustrating not only that the dialogue of charity is as a theological dimension, but that the dialogue of charity is really the core and the heart of the theological dialogue. We have now 15 minutes for questions. We have microphones. Yes, Your Excellency, Bishop Patriarchate, the Secretary of the Dicastery for Promoting Christianity. The microphones.
Thank you, Your Eminences, for this beautiful intervention. We are celebrating the 60th anniversary, but I think it is useful for the students also to remember and to put in the memory and in the midst of our churches the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of another gesture that manifest the meaning of the intervention of 60 years. Because in December 14, in the Sistine Chapel, 1975, Paul VI, after the celebration, and also with the vestment of the celebration, kneels in front of Meliton of Chalcedon and kisses his feet. And was, I think, at the time for the Roman Curia was very impressive, like formerly scandal, according to understanding. But it was impressive, I was very moved by reading some of the comments of Patriarch Demetrius when he knows the situation. With this gesture, the venerable and dearly beloved brother to us, the Pope of Rome, Paul VI, surpassed himself and showed the Church and the world what a Christian bishop is and can be, and above all, what the first bishop of Christianity is called to be, a force of reconciliation and for the unity of the churches and of the world. And I think this gesture manifests what 10 years before they signed the Common Declaration.
Your Eminences, thank you for both of your lovely talks on the theme of the canceling of the Anathemas of 1054. I wanted to ask regarding the recent celebrations of the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea last year. Before that, the Dicastery for promoting Christian unity published a document, the Bishop of Rome, to rediscover how the Pope's role as the Bishop of Rome can be interpreted. And this is a paraphrase from that document. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope's primacy should be promoted, thought of as a primacy of honor being exercised in communion with rather than dominion over sister churches. And it also expressed the hope that the Council of Nicaea would provide opportunities to practice synodality ad extra, by which representatives of different Christian traditions would meet together in fellowship and discernment. After the publication of that document, and after the anniversary just celebrated of the Council of Nicaea, what is your view on this today for both your eminences?
I will come back after.
This document is a study document, not an infallible declaration of the Catholic Church, because we have continued the ask of Pope John Paul II in his encyclical. He has invited all the Christian churches and the ecclesial community to enter in a dialogue with him to have a practice of the private of the Bishop of Rome, who is not an obstacle for unity, but a help for unity. And we have the impression in our dicastery that we must continue in this dialogue. And in this sense, the document gives the responses that we have just in the ecumenical word. And now we have sent this document to all churches, and we await the responses from the churches, and then we see we can continue this dialogue. This is the character of this document. Not a high declaration of the church. The Pope Francis has given the permission to publish this document, but it's not a confirmation of the Pope. The discussion must continue. And I think we have received just many responses and answers, and then we can see how we can continue. Because we are convinced that the Bishop of Rome can have a beautiful contribution for refining the unity in the churches, what is very needed in the society today. We live in a world with many troubles, with many differences, with many tensions and divisions, and in this sense, the Ecumenical movement can only be a help for this tragic and sad situation in the world, when the ecumenical movement is not a mirror of the tragic situation in the world, but say how we can, by all differences and all tendencies that we have, to have a common vision of the world, and for the ecumenical movement, a common vision of the church and the unity. This is my contribution, but you give the second.
I would like just to remind those of you who didn't read the document, the Bishop of Rome, first of all, to invite you to read it. This is a very important document, a very significant document, but just to remind you that this is a compilation of various bilateral dialogues. And what is very powerful and I would say extraordinary in that document is that there is an amazing convergence of what has been reached on the issue, the question of the Bishop of Rome, among the different bilateral dialogues. So this is a first point. This is, let's say, it's a document which presents us the convergence that we can see in the different bilateral dialogues that have been conducted for the last, let's say, more or less 50 years. And this is very encouraging. It shows that there is all the Christian churches today. Tonight we are focusing on the relations between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, between Rome and Constantinople, because of the tragic events of 1054 and the Anathemas. But we see significant progress in on the path towards Christian unity among all the Christians. So this is this gives us a very optimistic view of the future. Secondly, I would like just to make a personal comment. As far as I know, this document has been prepared by the Dicastery during the COVID period as an internal document, and later on, very recently, a few years ago, the late Pope Francis gave his blessing that this document may be published to everybody, so that everybody can read it. And I think that one of the visible fruits from that document was the very kind invitation that we received, all the Christian churches, from the Roman Catholic Church through the Dicastery of Promotion Christian Unity, from His Eminence Cardinal Koch, to send fraternal fraternal delegates to the Synod on Synodality of the Roman Catholic Church. And I had the joy to participate in the Synod on Synodality during 2 months, October 23 and October 24, with other fraternal delegates from other Christian churches. And I could say that we were not only observers looking from the side of from upstairs what's going on in the whole synodal hall, but we actually participated in the discussions. We were allowed to take the floor and make declarations, and this was an extraordinary moment. We all, the fraternal delegates, my colleagues, felt, first of all, that we were not only guests, but we were part of the synodal process, that we were part of the church, and this also brought us more closer together, one with another. And I think this gave a new dynamic to the ecumenical movement. And this new dynamic was the common desire, which was expressed by the fraternal delegates in October 2024 to Pope Francis, to go all together to Nicaea to celebrate all together the 1700th of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. And this wish became a reality thanks to the cooperation, the positive cooperation between the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Roman Catholic Church, the Dicastery for Promotion of Unity. All the churches were represented in Nicaea in November 2025. So this gives us a lot of hope for our common future.
Your Excellency, Ambassador of Greece to the Holy See.
Eminences, thank you so much for this insightful description and analysis of the events that lead to the uplifting of the Anathemas and all the analysis about the future and the possibilities to one church. This is a question I had also when I was really younger, when I was looking through the history of the churches, and it is what exactly triggered at that time in 1965. What triggered Pope at the time and also the Pope in Anathemas to come to this historical, let's say, times. What I mean by that is, it was a matter of personalities. It was a matter of the time that was mature, because you mentioned so many books that were written and so many theses that lead to these misconceptions. But sometimes I wonder, what was the triggering, what was the decisive thing that led to that thing in 1965? Because I think, if we want to look to the future, sometimes personalities matter, sometimes time matters, and we are already, let's say, 60 years of this ecumenical dialogue, 50 years, and of course, in comparison to the centuries until we reach 1965, it's very small. But again, the decisive moment to reach unity, it has to have a factor. So this is the next question. I don't know if I try to make this point clear, but I was young and I still have the same question now. Thank you.
Everything is a combination of many elements. If I started quoting long quotes from books from the 19th century and the 20th century, was to show the evolution that was made in scholarship. And this is very important. I think that the scholarship that was reached, especially with Congar, gave the foundations for the churches to take decisions, to take courageous decisions. So there is, first of all, of course, there is the effort made in the scholarship. Secondly, the event of 1965 could not have happened if there was not the green light from both churches. Vatican II gave the green light to the Roman Catholic Church to open itself to the rest of the Christian world. The Pan-Orthodox conferences that were taking place more or less at the same time gave the green light to the Orthodox Church to enter into contact with the Western churches. So there was the green light from both churches. And third, but not least, is the personal character of the two leaders. Pope Paul VI and Athenagoras believed in church unity. For them it was not a diplomatic wish. They believed that this was an obligation and they had this as a goal. Now I don't remember where exactly I read it, but I read several places where, for example, Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras said, "I love this man." And he had the photo of Paul VI in his office, and he always made this sign showing the chalice, that we have to work to get to the common chalice. So it was a goal for him.
I think too that first of all it depends on the personalities of the two persons, because Patriarch Athenagoras has an open heart, particularly in research to unity. I think he has also his ministry in the United States, in another situation and with many challenges. And of the other side, Paul VI was open, very open, and he was a pope of many symbolic gestures. The gesture was the Archbishop Archie that mentioned. We have another gesture when the Archbishop from Canterbury comes to Rome, and Paul VI take his ring and give the ring to the Archbishop. This is not only an unremarkable sign, but it's a very important sign. And I think also Paul VI was very clear that we must refine the unity between Constantinople and Rome. And I think the influence of the Second Vatican Council is the entering of the Catholic Church officially in the ecumenical movement. And the first step must be done in the ecumenical movement is reconciliation between East and West. I think two things, but I finish with it. We have not a contradiction, you have to say, which in this view too.
think, and I said it in my presentation, that from the very beginning, the work of the Joint International Commission has as an explicit goal the restoration of full communion between the churches. We are not just meeting to spend nice holidays in various nice places and to share nice meals and to have lively discussions between ourselves, but we have a goal, and this goal is the restoration of unity, communion. Now, we can see, personally, I can see two phases in the work of the Commission. At the beginning of the work, as I said, the work of the Commission is the fruit of the event of 1965. Without the event of 1965, nobody could have imagined having a common joint international commission. But at the beginning, we came there, I would say, as separate brothers. After 900 years of separation and alienation with all these images we cultivated in our common imaginary. And it was important in the first stage of the work of the Commission to work together, read together, define together what we share in common. And this is why the first 3 or 4 documents of the Commission focus on the sacraments. Do we have a same understanding of the sacraments of the Church? And do we have the same understanding of the sacramental nature of the Church? And these documents say yes. There is no differences about these questions. And this permitted the beginning of a second stage where the Commission tries to resolve misunderstandings of the past, because we, at least from the Orthodox side, but I think His Eminence will agree from the Catholic side, we cannot imagine the restoration of communion between the churches if we still have theological disagreements between ourselves. So now the time has come to discuss difficult matters. Who would have imagined 10 years ago that a commission, a joint commission, could discuss questions such as filioque or infallibility? I remember one Orthodox hierarch who participated a long time in the commission used to say, never speak about the filioque because the commission will collapse. Now we are discussing infallibility without any collapse. I mean, there is such a climate of sincerity and trust that we could speak to each other to clarify misunderstandings of the past. And this prepares the ground for the next step, which is the restoration of the communion. But I will add by saying another comment that was made by another Orthodox hierarch, a member of our commission, saying, don't go too fast. Very often people think that the problem in the church the problem is the theologians who create problems. But we experience in the commission that theologians could very quickly come to an agreement because they are ready to understand that there were misunderstandings, not proper readings, because of technical terms, because of languages, because of context, etc. And they can come to an agreement. But the people of God in the parishes are not ready to receive these agreements. how can we go further when we still have in our parishes, on both sides, people who still speak about the Great Schism of 1054 and regard each other as schismatic churches? Without purifying this memory through the work of purifying the memory, through these prophetic gestures that we evocated today, we cannot have a full reception of the agreements. So this is why the work on the grassroots is so important as well.
I will only underline that this commission is not only an academic seminar. It's clear we are very severe work, but this is an ecclesial work because we have a mandate from the churches for the restoration of the churches. And the great challenge for me is the reception of the results of the fruits of this dialogue in the churches. And I think we have many to do. Only for giving one example, after Christmas I have an interview in the television also about Theological. And I have mentioned only the practice of the popes, that I have given the creed without Theological, but I have received many accusations. Why you become heterodox? And this come not for the Orthodox, but for the Catholics. On the Catholic Orthodox side, you have other examples. And it means we need many work for the reception of the results. Then many people have faced and have the impression that we are two different churches, and the excommunication are vivid today. And in this sense, we must move in the commission, but on the other side, we must work many for the reception of the results of the fruits of this dialogue. Another way, we remain in the air.
Perhaps a very last question. Yes, can you introduce yourself, perhaps?
Thank you, Your Excellencies. My question is for Metropolitan Joe. So in the Catholic West, in the last few years, we've been investigating what does the term synodality mean for us. And I would say there's still a lot of diverse opinions about what do we mean by synodality. So could you give us your understanding from an Orthodox perspective of how you understand and live synodality?
Synodality, as many other words, is a very simple word, but there are several practices of synodality, such as, for example, democracy. Democracy is a very simple word, but you know very well that democracy is practiced differently in different countries. You have different systems of government in the countries. And a few years ago, that was in 2022 and 23. Yes, 22 and 23 here at the Angelicum, there were the conferences that was organized by the Foundation Pro Oriente together with the Angelicum, listening to the East, which try to present how synodality is practiced in the different Orthodox churches, the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church of Byzantine tradition, but also the other Oriental churches. But even before that, before COVID, we had a conference organized at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland about synodality, which tried to present how the synodal system of each autocephalous Orthodox Church works. And we were amazed to see that in each autocephalous church, although all agree about the concept of synodality, the way synodality functions is different. Do you imply all the bishops? Well, if it's a small church, such as, for example, the Orthodox Church of Cyprus, which is a relatively small church, it's easy to have all the bishops participate in the synod. If it's a large church like the Ecumenical Patriarchate or the Russian Orthodox Church, it's difficult to have all the bishops to participate in the synod. Then, how do you manage to make them participate in the synod? So we discovered that there are many different ways of practicing synodality. As well, there is always the question. Synodality is a meeting of bishops, either on the regional or a national level or a larger level. But what is in that practice of synodality the role of the clergy and of the laity? In some churches, they are completely almost excluded. They are just collaborators or consultants. In some other churches, to a certain extent, they participate up to a certain level. So there is a diversity. So, and this was very interesting to see this diversity, and I think that this diversity could be also inspiring for the renewal of synodality in the Roman Catholic Church.
And I invite you to look at this website of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity. We have the proceedings of these two symposia on listening to the East and also listening to the West, on the understanding and practices of synodality in the various Christian traditions. And one of the conclusions is there is not one synodality, but synodalities in the various churches and Christian communions. Perhaps it's time now to conclude our evening. I would like once again to thank our two speakers for their presentation. Thank you so much, Your Eminences. It was really a blessing. Since we are in the week of prayer for Christian unity, I would suggest to pray together for Christian unity, and after perhaps to have the blessing of our two churches at the end of the prayer. We can just say to our Father in English or in your own English.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil. May the blessing of the Lord be with you, through his grace and love for mankind, always, now and ever, and to the ages of ages. Amen.